Hey, just wondering if you played that new traditional roguelike?
Roguelite?
What? Traditional roguelikes have existed since the early 1980s, and since then, tens of hundreds of roguelikes have been created, slowly but surely cementing the genre as a big player in the gaming industry. Roguelikes were never the biggest or most popular genre, and have been largely delegated to the indie world. However, it can't be denied that roguelikes had a very important spot in the gaming industry, with many games being produced in the genre accompanied by thousands of fans building up over the years. Oh. I stand corrected. I guess it can be denied. However, despite their previous popularity, in recent years there has been a noticeable lack of traditional roguelikes, and a very, very noticeable increase in another genre, roguelites. A very evident shift has come about in all things rogue, with roguelites seemingly coming out on top over traditional roguelikes, absolutely skyrocketing in popularity in just over a decade and not seeming to be stopping anytime soon. And in this video, I'll be going over exactly how roguelites have rose to stardom and seem to have entirely superseded traditional roguelites. So, let's get into it. Before we can properly discuss the rise of roguelites, we need to go back and learn about the original roots of roguelites, the traditional roguelike. For this, I'm taking us way back to the 1980s. The 1980s, a time of electronic music, video games, and that.
Stop it. Get some help.
But while all that was great, minus that, the 1980s also saw the creation of a very interesting game. One that was so interesting, in fact, that it would go on to spawn its own entire genre. Yahoo! No, not that one. Not that one either. Okay, that one wasn't even in the 80s. It's Rogue. It's Rogue. Jeez. But what exactly is Rogue, you may ask? Well, Rogue, developed by Michael Toy, Glenn Wichman, and later Ken Arnold, and released in 1980, was a text and grid-based game that saw the player traversing through a series of randomly generated dungeons, fighting the monsters along their path in turn-based combat and collecting items along the way, with the final goal being reaching the lowest level of the dungeon and collecting the Amulet of Yendor, which is a very fun word to say, I might add, and going all the way back to the surface. Along with random generation of its layouts, monsters, and items, a key component that made this game stand out from the rest was its introduction of permadeath. This was a mechanic that basically meant that every time you died, you really died. You had to restart all the way back to the beginning of your journey with none of the items or collectibles you got in your run and replay the game again. And you did this again, and again, and again, until you got the amulet, and then some more. Seems boring on the surface, right? Get it? Surface? Because the game starts on the surface, and then you go deeper and play more of the game, which is like a parallel to how interesting the game gets when you wait. But what made the game fun to replay was the random generation aspect of it, working in tune with permadeath. Every single rerun of the game provided a brand new layout and adventure for the player, as the world around them was different than the last time they'd entered it, thus creating new encounters and experiences to explore. And with the permadeath aspect of the game, you could play a newly generated game over and over and over, creating near limitless hours of fun. This game became really popular in the years after its release. Its unique formula applied to a lot of fans, as no other game had taken an approach quite like Rogue did. You could replay the same game over and over and over and experience a brand new adventure on every run, thus creating near limitless similar games to enjoy. And with permadeath, reaching the end of the game was a real challenge, as you had to start from scratch with every new run, with the only thing you gained in each run being knowledge of the game itself. Now, granted, some other games that followed Rogue's formula did exist by Rogue's release, but Rogue pulled through as one of the most popular of the bunch, with its unique top-down D&D-esque style and later inclusion in 4.2 BSD, a very popular operating system at the time. Following the success of Rogue, many other developers made games following its same unique formula, and eventually, these games were numerous enough to be given their own genre designation, roguelikes. And this is where the original definition of a traditional roguelike was born. In summary, roguelikes were the genre term used for games that were like Rogue. Crazy, right? Basically, any game that shared the attributes and style of Rogue was considered a roguelike, and this was a classifier used for most every game that was considered like Rogue for a long time. That is, until the release of one very special game. On June 27th of 2013, Cellar Door Games released their hit title, Rogue Legacy. This game at first glance appeared to be an unsuspecting roguelike. It was a game and it was like Rogue. However, this was not really the case. The game was described by Cellar Door Games themselves as a roguelite with a T, a new term that based on my research hadn't been used prior to describe games that were like Rogue. To be fair, games like Spelunky and The Binding of Isaac had been released before Rogue Legacy and were roguelites by definition, but in my research, Rogue Legacy was the first to actually use the term roguelite to describe their game, so sorry Spelunky and The Binding of Isaac, but Rogue Legacy gets the spotlight here. I'm still using you for the thumbnail though, Spelunky. Love you. So why did Cellar Door Games call Rogue Legacy a roguelite, you may ask? Well, because it wasn't really an actual roguelike, but it was kinda a roguelike. Remember when I said a roguelike was classified as any game that was like Rogue? Well, that's true, but by the 2000s there were some specific requirements a game had to have to be considered canonically like Rogue. According to a consensus made in the International Roguelike Development Conference of 2008, an annual event held where those with an interest in roguelike development meet for 2 days of presentations and discussions, these specific requirements include random environment generation, permadeath, turn-based combat, grid-based in general, non-modal, complex, requiring resource management, being a hack and slash, and emphasis on exploration and discovery. Yeah, that's quite a lot of rules, so I'm just going to leave those up on the screen for you to maybe pause to read through so I don't have to suffer an asthma attack while trying to list them all out. Rogue Legacy obviously didn't have a portion of these rules implemented in its game, but other roguelites at the time also didn't have some of these rules, and yet they were called roguelites, so what made Rogue Legacy special? Well, one rule that Rogue Legacy broke was a really important rule to a traditional roguelike, arguably one of the most important of them all, and one that most roguelites at the time hadn't yet broken: permadeath. Now I know what you're saying, but TheFrosif, Rogue Legacy had permadeath, and you're right, but not totally. Rogue Legacy had a unique feature about its permadeath that set it apart from traditional roguelikes: meta progression. In short, this meant that Rogue Legacy had permadeath, but also a bit of progression in the form of permanent stat upgrades, unlocks, equipment, etc. This meant that the permadeath in Rogue Legacy wasn't really actual permadeath. In traditional permadeath, dying not only meant that you restarted all the way back to an origin point in the game, but also that you lost all the things you collected along the way. Thus, there was no real permanent progression in traditional roguelikes, as all the progress you made in one run had basically no effect on the following run since you didn't collect or gain anything other than knowledge of the game. In contrast, Rogue Legacy had some progression, as while you did lose a lot of the things you got in your run and restarted from an origin point when you died, you could collect permanent stat upgrades, equipment, etc. to use on your next run, thus creating some progression, or meta progression. This all culminates to the fact that Rogue Legacy was not fully a roguelike, but it was like Rogue, and so Cellar Doors dubbed their game a Roguelites instead of a roguelike. And boy, did Rogue Legacy really make a good first impression for roguelites. Tons of people flocked to the game, enjoying this new hybrid of traditional rogue aspects mixed with new ideas such as meta progression. The large success of Rogue Legacy and other early roguelites such as The Binding of Isaac and Spelunky then led to a lot of other roguelites being created, and as more and more roguelites flooded the market, roguelites cemented themselves as a true genre, entirely separate from traditional roguelikes. The actual definition of a roguelike over time grew to be any game that was like Rogue but not fully a roguelike. Either they omitted some aspects of a traditional roguelike, added some new aspects, or both. Many games would go on to be created using this formula in the coming decade, and as time passed, the genre only got more and more popular. Enter the Gungeon, Hades, Dead Cells, Risk of Rain 2, Slay the Spire, Wizard of Legend, Noita, Into the Breach, all these roguelites and more were rapidly met with very large success, garnering hundreds of thousands of fans, and eventually seem to have all but entirely shoved traditional roguelites out of the spotlight. Each and every one of these games has arguably garnered tons of more fans than traditional roguelikes, bringing attention to games like Rogue like no other traditional roguelikes had done before. While traditional roguelikes were, and to an extent still are popular, I think it's safe to say that they didn't garner nearly as much popularity as these new roguelites, who were drawing in tons and tons of fans to the genre. I mean, off the top of your head, name as many traditional roguelikes as you can. Now, compare that to how many roguelikes you can name off the top of your head. Yes, the giant list of them that I gave probably helped with that, but you get my point. I have no doubt that some amazing traditional roguelikes are being made to this day, but the success of roguelikes was so great that it's just sort of phased out traditional roguelikes in public popularity. So much so that the definition of a roguelike itself has been changed since the introduction and success of roguelites, giving more leeway as to what actually counts as a roguelike. In fact, nowadays, a lot of roguelites that are branded as roguelikes are technically roguelites, but with the huge success of roguelites, a lot of people just identify those games as roguelikes, since most don't know what traditional roguelikes are due to them being phased out by roguelites. From its origins with Rogue, its cementation in Rogue Legacy, and its large success today, roguelites are quite a force to be reckoned with. They have pretty much taken over everything rogue in the gaming industry, garnering hundreds of thousands of fans to the genre and exploding games like Rogue to a size they have never experienced before. As for traditional roguelikes, while they are still great and are still being made to this day, they just seem to have been entirely phased out by roguelites. So much so that the definition of a roguelike itself has been altered to more so fit that of a roguelite. And as time goes on, roguelites may very well be all that's left of games like Rogue. But, dear viewers, I must ask, what do you think about roguelites? For those who were alive in the 80s, were traditional roguelites as big of a hit as roguelites today? Are traditional roguelikes entirely phased out, or will they make a comeback? Please let me know in the comments.